who was also one of the early founders of IndieWire, that came out. And I bring that up, and I was speaking with Kimberly about this morning, because IndieWire came out around the same time that Boys Don't Cry came. And I think it was a big synergy of independent cinema and alternative cinema in general that Eugene can speak more about. So I'd like to welcome up Eugene Hernandez.
Thank you, Michael. I love being in this theater. I love being at this festival. Thank you to Michael and to everybody who makes this festival happen. It's truly a wonderful weekend experience. So congratulations to you, Michael, and to everyone involved with the festival. Again, thank you. Give him a hand. And I do hope you'll take the opportunity to see as many movies as you can this weekend, even though the weather is beautiful. There's, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. There's a terrific program of movies that have been curated, including some films in the LGBT section that my colleague Brian Brooks and I have curated, so you'll be seeing us presenting some of those films this weekend. But that's for later. We are so thrilled to have Kimberly Peirce here to present the 20th anniversary of Boys Don't Cry. This is a movie that is a landmark film. I've rewatched it recently to prepare for this conversation, and it is as devastating and as moving and as, I would say, visionary as it feels all of those things just as it did when I saw it for the first time 20 years ago, 19 years ago. We'll talk about that now before we watch the movie. Kimberly Peirce, welcome. Hello.
Hello.
And I told Kim that I would ask the audience, is there anybody here tonight who has not seen Boys Don't Cry? Because, okay, good, just want to make note of it because, yeah, I want to be sensitive to how much we give away. So we'll talk around aspects of the film. Some of you may already know the story on which it's based, but we'll talk about sort of what led to the movie and the context in which it was created, rather than talk too much about specific aspects of the movie, because you're about to have an incredible experience with the film itself, and we want the film to speak for itself. But maybe, and we kind of started talking about this unexpectedly in the lobby, Kim, maybe you could help us transport us back 20 years to, well, maybe one way to start. Tell us about your life 22 years ago as you were embarking on this film, and tell us about some of the initial, what initially kind of moved you to want to pursue this story, and why it was sort of meaningful to you.
It's a great question. So I'll go way back really quickly.
Yeah.
My parents were 15 when they had me, so they were kind of like good-looking kids. Yeah, it was a love child. Good-looking kids in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My dad ended up bringing me down to Florida at 5, so we were bachelors together, and we would just come down to the Keys and go and get a Rolling Rock and go to the bars and go out diving. So great beginning. So he was a bigger-than-life character. She was a bigger-than-life character. Cut to, I was very lucky that I got myself through the University of Chicago. Then I went to Columbia grad school and had Martin Scorsese and Schrader and amazing people teaching me. Long story short was, those were a lot of straight white men, and they were brilliant. So I loved my education, but there was something scratching at me that was not being answered, and I didn't quite know what it was. I started to write about a woman who passed as a man during the Civil War. My lesbian playwright, Professor Corinne Jacker, said, you don't want to make the movie of somebody who lives as a man to survive. You want to make the story of somebody who lives as a man because it's who they are. Now, there was no story like that, but the movie gods are like this. I had a problem. It was my graduate thesis. It disappeared. And late one night at 4 in the morning, my best friend, queer, came in. We were doing the midnight shift at the law firm. I projected movies and worked at the law firm. If you worked at midnight, you got $3 extra an hour. And he brought me this crazy story of Brandon Tina, and I opened it up, and it was literally my entire life changed. It was like I adopted somebody, and it became that thing of being scratched in the back of your head. The straight white male patriarchal narrative, which I was learning from, left out something, Here was somebody who was female-bodied, I'm female-bodied. They were living and loving as a man, so I fell in love with Brandon's imagination to create himself into his fantasy of himself. Of course, because that was an extension of where I was going. I was just coming out as, it's funny, the terms have changed. I was gay, right, homosexual, but I also was, we didn't even have the word then, but I was what we would call genderqueer. Right, I'm a tomboy, I dress like a boy, I sometimes pass as a boy. And when I saw what Brandon did, it was as Schrader said, because he was my teacher, he's like, this is the perfect thing for you to write about because you have the ability to transform. Because he said that Travis Bickle was in a moving coffin. That's what he said to me about when I was working on boys. But the interesting thing was I went to Corinne, my lesbian professor, and she said, you have to decide. Does this person want to be a boy or do they want to sleep with girls? And I said, well, you can't separate them. She said, you have to. You're too obsessed with the truth. And I said, okay, I am obsessed with the truth, but what do I do? Thank God I got to go to Sundance. And at Sundance, Frank Pearson, who wrote Dog Day Afternoon, Cool Hand Luke, I said to him, I got a problem. Does Brandon want to be a girl? Does Brandon want to sleep, does Brandon want to be a boy or sleep with women? And I said, because Corinne is saying I got to pick one. And he said, it's neither. I said, so you totally, am I allowed to use the F word? Oh, yeah. You totally fucked me, right? And he's like, it's neither. I'm like, okay, what is it? He's like, well, I'm asking you, what is it? And he said, what is Sonny's need in Dog Day? Now, when the person who wrote Dog Day Afternoon says to you that the character you're writing has the same need as Sonny, at that point you have to pick yourself up off the floor because you're like, my God. And does anybody want to venture a guess? Why does he let the Brooklyn women go to the bathroom when he's robbing the bank? What does he need? Love.
Yep.
So it was great. So there it was, a straight white man gave me the need, which is all to say we're all connected. And we're all different, we're all the same. The beauty was it took somebody like that to understand Brandon more deeply even than a queer person might have, in a dramaturgical sense.
It's fascinating having this part of the conversation now because just a couple of hours ago we had Andi Timiner, the filmmaker, who's in the audience right now on stage, and we talked about the Sundance Labs and the process of kind of digging deeper with creative colleagues, with potential mentors, digging into a story to try to figure out what that story is and how to find that story. At the same time, all of this was happening in the late 90s, right? What year is this? What year was the
Well,
Frank
interestingly,
Pearson?
Brandon unfortunately was murdered on December 31st, 1993.
Yes.
There was no language around, I mean, not none, but we were talking about this. I mean, I grew up here, in Miami, and I was saying I didn't know what a gay person was. I found out there was a gay male version. It didn't even occur to me that there were gay women until I was a big tennis player. And they were like, oh, Martina Navratilova is a lesbian. And I was like, what's a lesbian? But it took a long time before I figured that out.
It's amazing to think of a time in which the language and the definition for what a kid might be, a young person might be, was not already fully formed, meaning you couldn't reference specific
For people under a certain
definitions.
age, it's important that you know, it wasn't until I went to New York City and went to the Lesbian Herstory Archives, and I was so electrified by reading books that even talked about two women being together. It was just, because I was like, oh, that's what I am, but it was like, it took forever to figure it out.
And so maybe the follow-up question I have then is to maybe share with us a little bit of, it couldn't have been easy to want to tackle a story, however connected you felt to it, however drawn you were to the subject matter and to this person. The film community, the industry, not many folks outside of Sundance and a few pockets were necessarily ready to embrace, let alone support, finance, distribute a movie about such topics.
And I think it's important, like, so oftentimes I get asked, did you set out to win the Oscar by making this movie? It was insane. If you think back then, James Seamus was my professor. I mean, I had brilliant people that I worked with, Christine Vachon. Even a gay movie at that point barely got made, and if it got made, it was lucky if it made $2.5 million. And at that point, it was only homosexual, pretty much male on male. So there was no paradigm for making it. The second thing, though, I was so obsessed with this person that I adopted them immediately. Within 2 weeks, I was interviewing trans people. Jay Prosser is one. And then I met up with a group called the Transsexual Menace, which is trans person, Kate Bornstein, who is a male to female, Ricky Ann Wilkins, Tony Brito Netto, all to say it was trans people who were activists who had formed a group called Transsexual Menace. They said, we're going to the murder trial. Would you like to come with us? I went nuts. It was like 3 or 4 weeks into being obsessed with this story. I traveled with them to Lincoln, Nebraska, and lived with them for a week. And I interviewed them. So I'm donating all of this to the Academy. There had never been anything like this, but it was interesting to me because I thought, I wanted to write it from a trans point of view and cast a trans person. And at some point, Kate Bornstein said, I think you're trans. And I said, oh, okay. Because I had short hair and, I was, a tough tomboy. I was open-minded, and I said, okay. She said, I'm going to call you he. So she called me he for a week. And she said, you sat up when I said that. And I'm like, yeah, it's kind of cool. So she said, you might be a transsexual, which was complicated for me only because I was like, do I want to take hormones? Do I want to have surgery? I don't know. And I was so young and open that I entertained it for a while and then ultimately landed where I am, which is something I do want to address. We went to the murder trial. I stayed with her. I met all the real people. What I was contemplating with Brandon was the idea that you would aim to be a female-born person and you would transition to be a trans person. But I stopped Brandon before he had surgery or hormones because we know he never got that far. The old version of transness was that you moved to the other identity. I've always been very much in the middle on the continuum and happy with my weirdness. And only now is the culture starting to say that maybe we don't want to live in the binary, which for me I've always thought ultimately was the healthiest thing for a patriarchal situation, but I don't want to give away too much. But anyway, does that make sense?
It totally does. It totally does.
The happy moving middle.
We have 7 or 8 minutes left, and let's pivot slightly because the movie, well, one thing I'll say, and it connects with what Michael was saying about IndieWire. IndieWire was very young at the time, and every step of achievement for this movie felt like the win. Do you know what I mean? Like just getting the movie made with who made it and the people behind it, and then getting it to Venice, getting it to Toronto, to New York, to
Thank you for
getting
saying
it released. You know what I mean? Like
he knows, and this is important. I don't want to cut you off.
Please.
Well, what he's saying is the lifeline of a movie. So in particular, that movie, finding somebody, it took me 3 years. I spent all my own money. I interviewed every trans person who ever wanted to audition, every butch lesbian, every genderqueer person, every actress, because suddenly we got straight actresses. Once we got that, and then we had to find that cast, it was like we couldn't find the pretty girl who was going to play Lana. Chloe Sevigny was extraordinary, but I had looked at hundreds of women who just didn't have the depth. Peter Sarsgaard, I had looked at hundreds of guys, he had the humanity. I said to him, you don't scare me. And I said, you gotta motherfucking scare me if you're gonna play this role. And that's what we did. So finally getting the cast working, we got to set, and a week in, they said, IFP is gonna wire you to film you and listen to you when you direct a sex scene. And I'm like, nobody's gonna listen to me when I direct a sex scene. And I said, why? And they said, well, they just gave us $1 million. So to me, $1 million was $1 billion. And I was like, we're rich. They were like, no, we were going to shut you down after the first week because we only had 700,000 out of the 2.1. You see, there's still 500 missing. So it was essentially that. It was literally every step of the way. Then, there were other issues. The movie was always in a catastrophic state of falling apart, but it was probably because I lived and died for the movie. My friends would make fun of me and say, Kim, are you okay? You're just kind of walking around with that book bag and that big script. It just was an obsession, and I'm happy because I'm older now. I don't know what we do at this age.
And so it's amazing to hear you say that because we can look at this now from the perspective of 20 years and the Academy Awards and how much has changed in culture and in media, which is a whole other conversation after you watch the movie. But we'll talk about that later another time. But the other piece we have to talk about before we watch the movie is Hilary Swank. And because the performance was so celebrated, Oscar-winning performance, can you just give us a little bit of context about how the two of you came together and kind of the conversations you had early on?
Sure.
And maybe the thought process you had now with time looking back about casting her in that role and building that character with her.
Well, I think, to me, I now recognize the radicalness of my obsession with casting a trans person. And I don't think that people always recognize that, but that was all I ever thought. I was like, Brandon's a trans, I'll find a trans, that's how we'll do it. After 3 years, and we had seen everybody, we didn't have anybody to play the role. Late one night, it was Kerry Barden, who's great, he went out, and I would get tape after tape, and nobody was right. Suddenly this person came across the screen, and this is important, they blurred the gender line. You weren't, is this a boy, is this a girl? You're just like, there's a blurring going on, which we knew Brandon blurred the gender line. We also knew that Brandon didn't always, the term is passing, you have to be careful when you use it, but that was the term we used. Brandon didn't always pass. He leaked out, his ultimately female bodiness leaked out because he didn't have facial hair, he wasn't on hormones, he wasn't built, he was tiny. So that person did that. The other thing that Hillary did was she retained a kind of masculinity while being so deeply winning and charming. This human being smiled and you fell in love with him, and we were like, oh, Brandon didn't just sleep with women and pass as a man. Brandon won over mothers, Brandon won over people. There was a charm. Hillary, it's interesting that people, I want people to know this. It's important that Brandon had to pass on screen as much as Brandon might have passed in the world, at least on a level that you didn't then discount all the actors and their roles, right? Because if Hillary didn't pass, then you wouldn't buy the whole situation. But the other thing was, this was a person who needed to carry an entire movie. And they were in every scene, and they were the lifeline of the movie. That's why you need an actor. And this is something that I think that you people as theater goes understand, but some people don't always understand the importance of acting and carrying a movie. And Christine said that. She said, you need somebody who can carry the movie. Hillary carried that movie. So the fact that she won the Oscar at a time when movies like that didn't win Oscars, they didn't get nominated, it was an uphill battle to overcome the obstacles to her winning, is a testament to how good she is. And I think when you watch it, I think you forget, that's why I don't even want to use the gender. I think you buy into Brandon because I think Hillary was that committed. So that's why when I get kind of asked now about the contemporary, would I do it differently? No, if you find the actor who can bring it to life, of course wouldn't want to make an African-American movie and have a white person play the lead. I mean, nobody wants to do any of that, but you also, at a certain point, you have to find the human being who can do it, because if you don't, Boys would never have been what Boys is.
We're about to start the film. We have like 2 minutes left. Have you gone back and do you watch the movie? Do you watch your movies
It's
years
a good
later?
question. I also want to say about Hillary, I had Hillary work with the trans people that I worked with.
Yeah.
So Hillary lived as a boy, Hillary worked with the trans people. They loved the performance because she worked with them. And I didn't watch it for a few years, and then it was being celebrated at Frameline a few years ago.
Frameline's the LGBT festival in San Francisco.
Maybe 8 years ago. And I started watching it again, and I was so upset. And I went to the murder trial. I got all the exhibits. I have the one tape when Hillary's being interviewed by the sheriff. Hillary's actually listening to the real tape of Brandon, because I had the one audio tape of the real Brandon. The point is, the movie. I think making the movie was my way of dealing with the pain and the catharsis and the love. Then I was kind of inured to it. And in the last 8 years, if I started to watch the movie, should I give this away? I cry in the minute. I start crying halfway through. So by the time I get to the stage, I'm generally devastated almost by what we all did at that time when we had no model for what we were doing, that we were inventing a language for our sexual preference and our gender identity and our humanity. And multiple people have come up to me and said, movies aren't made that way anymore. And I don't want to say that Boys is something other than other movies, other than to say its deep emotionality I do believe is unique, and I aim for empathy.
Mm-hmm. It's there, it's on the screen. We shouldn't say anything else about this movie because I think you've set it up so well and you've been so generous with your comments and sort of contextualizing. I think it's not only the world in which the film was made, the time in which it was made, but where you were as an artist at that point in your life as well. So we'll talk more about you tomorrow night at the award.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for presenting. Enjoy your presentation.